Thank you for joining us for this podcast from Atlee Church. Atlee is a safe place for those who gave up on church or never went. Our mission is to reach seekers and equip believers to love God, love themselves, love others, and serve the world. We would love for you to join us for one of our live services across any of our campuses, both physical and online. You can find service times and locations on our website, as well as information about small groups and where to volunteer. We hope that you will be both encouraged and challenged to take the next step in your personal faith journey through the message you are about to hear.
All right, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to the person next to you and tell them to come alive. Now, the best way I know to come alive is to take a hike. So turn back to that person and say, take a hike. Very good, very good. 2,185 miles long, give or take. At its highest peak, it reaches 6,643 feet above sea level. At its lowest peak, it only reaches 124 feet above sea level. It spans 14 states, and depending on which way you start or end, it begins in Mount Katahdin in Maine and ends in Springer Mountain, Georgia. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Appalachian Trail, very good. Some of you have obviously, if you haven't been there, you know a little bit about it, but how many of you have ever hiked any part or walked any part of the Appalachian Trail? Yeah, many of us have. Anybody know anybody who's actually going from end to end? Yeah, I know this morning, actually, an uncle of one of the folks playing in the band here has actually walked from end to end. I know a guy, in fact, he was on staff at Atlee many, many years ago, who actually was trying to walk it, got about 2/3 of the way through, developed these really bad shin splints and was unable to finish it. And I know he was very disappointed because he never really got to go back and actually finish it. But it's estimated that 2 to 3 million people, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people every year hike at least a portion of the AT. And out of that 2 to 3 million people that attempt or walk part of it every year, an even smaller portion actually completes it. In fact, since 1936, it's estimated that only a little over maybe 20,000 people have actually hiked from one end to the other. And so I did some math, and that's roughly maybe 350 people a year since then. It takes approximately 5 to 7 months to hike from end to end. Now, there have been those who have actually made it in much less time than that, some who have made it in 50 days. And that seems to be about the record at this point. But that's somebody who is getting it. I mean, head down, they're not looking around. They've got one goal in mind. I'm going to get from this end to that end and be able to say that they have actually finished it. And I wonder about those kind of people. While, the accomplishment's got to be awesome, I wonder how much they miss along the way, because there's so much to experience on the Appalachian Trail, whether it's just a portion of it. I can't imagine what it would be like to hike the whole thing and take it all in, but here's some of the things that you can expect to experience and encounter if you walk this trail. First of all, when it comes to mammals, how many of you knew that you could possibly run into a moose on the Appalachian Trail? You actually can. Now you're thinking not in Virginia, and I would agree if you run into one in Virginia, you might want to, run. I don't know what you would do in that case. White-tailed deer. Black bear are very common. Anybody ever see a bear up on the Appalachian? Yeah, so I've seen several up there. There's beaver, there are chipmunks, rabbits, squirrels, foxes, raccoons, possums, skunks, groundhogs, porcupines, bats, weasels, shrews, and minks. And my wife's favorite is otters. She loves otters for some reason. So that's just a sample of what you can experience when it comes to animals. What about birds? When it comes to birds, you got hawks, woodpeckers, warblers, thrashers, wrens, nuthatches, flycatchers, sapsuckers, grouse, and my favorite, turkey buzzards. I don't know why I like turkey buzzards up there, but it's just something about watching those big birds soar up there is just incredible to watch them. When it comes to reptiles and amphibians, there's frogs, there's salamanders, turtles, rattlesnakes, and copperhead. Not my favorite thing to run into up there. Plants, 2,000 species of plants are believed to live along the Appalachian Trail, with 200 of those species only being in the southern part of the Appalachian. In fact, you can only find them there in that part of the Appalachian. And then when it comes to terrain, the terrain is just as diverse as everything else about there. There's steep climbs and descents, peaks where you can stand and see for miles, literally both sides. I mean, there are places where I've stood up there that you can actually get a 360-degree panoramic view of everything around you. You can see as far north, far south, east, and west. It's incredible to see some of that. You'll experience thick forest, open flowing meadows, cliffs, lakes, ponds, streams, waterfalls, rock formations like you've never seen before. I don't know if you've ever hiked the section down near Peaks of Otter. Lynette and I accidentally found ourselves hiking this trail one day and part of it, and ran across some of the most amazing rock formations that we had ever seen. It was like somebody huge had picked up this big round boulder and put it on the very tip of another rock, and it looked like you could just walk over and push it and it would roll off the top of it. One of our favorite places when it comes to overlooks up there is a place called Black Rock Overlook. Again, just an incredible places, but these are some of the things that you can expect to experience. Sunrises and sunsets. If you've never been up there to watch either of those, I'm telling you, you're missing it. Now, I can remember being in elementary school, 4th grade, and it was my first introduction to the Appalachian Trail. This couple had come in, they had gathered all of us kids in the cafeteria. Back then we had the cafeteria and a stage in there, and they brought in this big movie projector, one of the old school ones that had the big reels, and it would wind from one reel to the other. And for me, having just left West Virginia and now living in Virginia, it was quite the experience. But I remember sitting there, and I still remember this to this day. Again, 4th grade. They're showing this video and this movie of their experience with the Appalachian Trail. And I remember sitting there and just being awed by what I was seeing and thinking, man, I would love to see that in person one day. Now, as an adult, I have seen a lot of it, far from seeing the whole thing. In fact, I probably haven't, couldn't even say I've probably seen a third of it. But what I have seen, I can say this: it never disappoints. It never disappoints. And it doesn't matter what season of life you're in up there. It's just incredible. It's always an adventure. You could spend your lifetime exploring and experiencing and enjoying this incredible trail. Now, where am I going with this? As incredible as that trail is, as incredible as that hike, that walk, however you choose to take it in, as incredible as it is, that adventure doesn't even begin to compare to the adventure that I've been on with Christ for the past 38 years, and the adventure that all of us can be on. It doesn't even come close to that. It's a journey that I hope to inspire you to take and experience. And I say that no matter where you're at in your spiritual journey, if you're just in this exploration place of what is church, what is God, and maybe that's why you're here and you're joining in at one of our campuses or this morning or online. If that's you, or maybe you're a seasoned believer, maybe you've been a follower of Christ for a long, long time, and maybe your adventure is kind of plateaued, and you're not having the adventure that you used to have. I hope that through this series to inspire that, to wake that up. Now, before we get any further, I do want to take just a moment and welcome you to all of our campuses, especially those watching online. I am so glad that you're here for this journey. This is really, while we're starting a new series today, it's really just a continuation of a journey that we started on January 5th with our 2020 series. I believe there's a series of things that God's going to take us through, especially this first quarter and maybe a little beyond of this year, that ultimately all ties together. And so I'm looking forward to having this journey and going on this journey with you. Now, on the Appalachian Trail, you will come across these signs if you've ever been there. Some that have this logo, especially the AT symbol on there, and they're usually just a little post and a little round sign, and what these signs are there to do for is to keep you on the path and to let you know that you're still on the Appalachian Trail. Now, that's not the only signs that you're going to find as you're walking this trail. As you're walking this trail, you're going to come across signs that are actually going to take you off the beaten path. They're going to veer you off, and as you do, they're there to help you to experience even more of the Appalachian Mountains. And so you might walk off on one trail and find yourself again at some crazy overlook or some cliff or some incredible waterfall. I mean, you just never know what you're going to find, and then those signs will bring you back up to your journey, and you can continue to walk that trail. There's so much about the Appalachian Trail that reminds me of my walk and your walk with God. A few years ago, I came up with 3 words that kind of serve as signposts for us to mark out our journey, our spiritual journey, that would lead us into some incredible spiritual transformation and adventure with God. And so if you've been around Atlee for any amount of time, especially if you go through our membership class, maybe this is the first time that you really get introduced to them, but those words are up here. It's the word explore, experience, and express. You see those, and so we've kind of said that if you're always on this exploration with God, if you're always exploring, always expressing, or always experiencing, and always expressing God and God's grace, that you're always going to be growing. But if you ever stop doing any of those things, you just kind of plateau, and the adventure stalls. And you don't adventure and explore and experience anything new from God. Now, you may notice this one up here on the very end, this one that has question marks on it. So this year, or actually last year, Trey and I began to evaluate where we were at as a church and our processes. And one of those processes was this adventure that we call the 3 E's, or this idea that we're always exploring, experiencing, expressing God's grace. And we felt like something was missing. Like there should be at least one more piece to this puzzle. And as we began to talk about it and think about it, we realized that there is something missing. And so we need your help. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to ask you to submit your idea of what you think this 4th word should be. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. We already know what it is, and if you want to know what it is, then you're going to have to be here in 3 weeks, because I'm not going to tell you until then. So it'll just kind of hang there, but I'm excited about it because I'll be honest with you. I really think this is a game changer. I really do think, as Trey and I began to really work through this, and the more that we talk about it, the more excited we both get about it, because we really do believe that this is a piece that can take these other 3 to a whole nother level. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing that and letting you know what that is. So, but if you want to take a stab at it, just send me an email. You can do it at stories@atlee.org. However you want to write it on your program, drop it in the prayer boxes or the offering boxes as you leave, and we'll see how many actually figure it out maybe before we get there. It might be kind of fun to do that. And if you actually get it right, Trey is going to have some big prize. I'm just kidding. Because a bunch of you get it right, and then he will be scrambling to come up with enough prizes to give everybody. So I won't do that to him. So today, here's where I want to begin. I want to begin right here. with this word explore, this idea of exploring God, exploring grace, because I think this is where every great adventure begins. Whether you're hiking the AT or you're beginning a relationship with God, this is where it all begins. Now, on the back of your program, you should have got when you came in, I'll give you this definition for explore. It's this idea to search out, to investigate, to study, and to analyze. I like that first part, to search out. In other words, there's something specific that we're looking for. We're not just, randomly walking and seeing what happens, but sometimes there's specific things that we're looking for and hoping to experience. And as we walk through this and as we walk through our walk with God, I think that that's exactly what we're doing. Now, if our walk through this life and our walk with God is about anything, again, I think it's about exploring. And of all the people, I sat down and I thought about this coming to this series, of all the people in the Bible, now we're going to see that exploration is a huge part of being a follower of Christ. But of all the people that I thought about in the Bible who fit this, who was an example of what it looked like and meant to explore, and especially to explore things of God, it was King Solomon. King Solomon, by far, is just a perfect example of this. If maybe you don't know who King Solomon was was the son of King David, a famous king of Israel that we read about in the Old Testament. King Solomon, his son, took his place and was in a lot of ways just as famous as David, his father, was. And in fact, Solomon was the one who actually built the first temple, permanent temple to worship God in. David had led up to this point, but was unable to do that, and he passed that off to Solomon. But Solomon went on to write 3 of the books that now make up the Old Testament, or part of our Old Testament. And there, of all the books of the Old Testament, at least 2 of the 3 are very unique. These books kind of chronicle his experience and what he learned as he went through life. Of these books, Proverbs is probably the most famous, probably the most read, and it's one of those things, it's a book that you just can't read it all at once. You can only take it in small chunks because you read this statement that he makes and then you're like, okay, I need to think about that for a little bit and how that applies. So that's one book of the Bible, honestly, that you could spend your entire life reading and just chunks of it and thinking about how it applies to the rest of your life. And then there are 2 other books, the book of Ecclesiastes, one that often gets quoted at funerals, especially one of the first things in there where he talks about there's a time for everything under the sun, and that often gets quoted. I know I often quote it as a setup for messages that I get on funerals, and so it's just kind of out there, and it's like he explored all of these things and he didn't know what to do with it, and he's like, it's almost depressing because he kind of walks away and says life is meaningless. All of it is just meaningless. And then you jump over to the book called Song of Solomon. Anybody ever read the Song of Solomon? Yeah, some of you guys are grinning because it's like an R-rated love letter in the Bible. Now, if you've not read it, I do not recommend that you read it to your middle school kids, okay? Because it'll be embarrassing for you and them. But if you've never read it, take some time to read it because it's just kind of out there. It's different. All right, so those are the books that we got as he writes from his experiences and his adventure. Now, how did he get there? How did he become so wise? In fact, it's believed that Solomon is still to this day the wisest person to have ever lived. Maybe outside of Jesus Christ, obviously, but the actual man, he is believed to this day to still be the wisest person that ever lived. So how did he get there? How did he become so wise? Well, there's one verse, something that Solomon himself says that I think points to how and why he became so wise. And it's this one found in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 13. Solomon says, I set my mind. In other words, I made up my mind to do this. This is how I was going to spend my life, to seek and explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. Everybody say explore. Everybody say seek. And everybody say wisdom. King Solomon made it his life's goal to explore life and particularly with a certain point of view. So he says, I made up my mind to seek and explore by wisdom. For if you read the book of Proverbs especially, you see that Solomon couldn't separate God from wisdom. In fact, for him, they were one and the same thing. And if I were to read just a couple of verses as he begins this book of Solomon, or this book of Proverbs, here's what he says. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And he says, here's why I wrote it. For gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right, just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. And then he says this, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Some translations will say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so for Solomon, as he went on this journey of exploration, he did it wanting to see things the way God saw them. He knew that God had created all of this, and he created mankind, he created this world. And so Solomon said, I'm going to seek and I'm going to spend a lifetime of exploring by wisdom from a godly perspective, everything that exists under the sun. And that's exactly what he did. Solomon isn't the only one to inspire people, though, to explore. Did you know that God, through Jesus Christ, asked us to take the same approach to life that Solomon did? He invites us on an adventure of exploration. In fact, let me show you something that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Jesus himself said this, ask, everybody say ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, everybody say seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. So these are three key words in this simple encouragement, this simple challenge that Jesus gives to every single one of us. These are words of exploration. Ask, seek, knock. He invites us and challenges us and encourages us to do this so that we, like Solomon, can be wise, but beyond just being wise for the sake of knowledge, but to understand life, understand ourselves, understand others. Along with this, there's a promise that comes along with every one of these words. First of all, he says, ask, and the promise is, you will what? It will be given to you. He says, seek, and the promise is, you will find. And he says, knock, and it'll be open to you. These are promises that Jesus makes to us if we will take this journey, if we will begin to explore, if we'll ask, it'll be given to us. If we'll take the time to search for it, we'll find it. And if we'll knock, and this word knock is interesting because it's this idea of being given access to something. He says, if you'll knock, it'll be open to you. Now, I want to take just a few moments and explore this invitation, this challenge that Jesus gives to us by just looking at these three words. And I'm going to spend the most of my time on the very first one. But on the back of your program, again, if you want to take some notes, so the first thing that he invites us to do is to ask. And this word simply means to petition. To petition. The specific definition that I found as it relates to this word is this: the petition of one who is lesser in position than he to whom the petition is made. Read it one more time. The petition of one who is lesser in position than he to whom the petition is made. Now, I think it's important that we understand this because I think we often petition the wrong people. So just follow me for a moment as I thought about this. I think we often petition people who don't really have the means or the capacity or even the resources to deliver, to help us with what we're actually looking for. We tend to approach people who are just like us and in the same situation and circumstances that we are, or maybe in the same boat that we are. And we begin to talk with people like that, and they can tell you how they ended up there and how you ended up there. But the problem is they can't tell you how to get out of that boat. And so we don't gain anything. And so what we're encouraged to do is petition those. Now, don't get me wrong, we can learn from each other. We can learn from everyone. But petition particularly God. Someone who has the bigger view, who understands how and why things work the way they work, because he created all of that. Like Solomon, we should be asking the one who created us. I'm going to show you a couple verses, just walk through a couple things with you. This first one in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20 says this: "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all that we could ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us." Who do you think Paul is writing about there? He's talking about God. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all that we could ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. In other words, I want you to think about this, that we're going to come back to this verse in week 4 of this series. This is a powerful verse and an idea that's going to go along with this mystery word. But here's what I want you to think about right now. If you can imagine it, it could happen. That's what he says. You know, we're limited by our own dreams. We're limited by our own doubts. You know, oftentimes we think, well, wouldn't it be cool if, but, you know, it'll never happen. Well, who says it can happen? Think about all the things that have happened since the beginning of creation that people thought would never happen. How many of us sit in a world today that I can remember sitting with my grandparents back in West Virginia, and they didn't even have running water in their house. And to think and imagine what has happened in the past 50 years since that. Guys, we serve a God that's not limited by imagination. And yet all we have to do is ask and see what happens. Again, we'll come back to this in a couple of weeks. Here's another verse to think about. Colossians 1:9 says this: "For this reason, since the day that we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you." In other words, Paul writes to a group of people who have become followers of Christ, and he hasn't met them yet, but he's heard about their faith, and he's so excited about what's going on to them that he writes this letter to encourage them, and he says, "We're always praying for you." And he continues, he says, "We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives." Now this verse and the next couple of verses in this passage are actually where I pulled these 3 words from. This idea of explore, experience, and express. So just to point it out, we continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge. Where do we get knowledge from? By exploring, right? We take the time to learn something new or to figure it out or at least see what God has to say about it. And Paul's like, I pray that you will be filled with knowledge. And that knowledge is only going to come as you take the time to explore who God is. And he says we continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. And this is where the experience comes in. It's one thing to know, but it's another to experience it by applying it to your life. And so Paul says, I want you to explore God's truth. I want you to explore God's grace, God's forgiveness, and we could go down a whole list of things, but I don't want you just to explore it because I want you to experience it for yourself. I want you to see how what you learn applies to your life. Another verse, this one in James. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. Everybody say, ask God. Who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. How many of you would raise your hand and say, I know somebody who could use a little bit of wisdom? Yeah, some of you think, I know somebody who could use a whole lot of wisdom, right? We all know people like that. We might say they're dumb as a box of rocks. So we all got people like that. But how about us? How many of us could use a little bit of wisdom? How many of you could use a little bit of wisdom? and yet it's there for the asking. That's what James says. James is a half-brother of Jesus. He didn't always believe that his brother was the Christ until he himself saw Jesus come back from the dead. It's something about somebody coming back from the dead, especially after been there 3 days, that would make anybody believe if they really think about it. And so James is like, wow, my brother really was who he claimed to be. And so he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. You know how Solomon became so wise? It wasn't just because he explored. It started by asking God for it. In fact, in 1 Kings chapter 3, here's how the story goes. Solomon is sold out, he's worshiping God, but he's also kind of mixed in with some other stuff, but God knows his heart's right. And so one day God comes to Solomon and he says, Solomon, he says, what would you like for me to do for you? He says, you name it and I will do it. Now, I want you to think about how you would answer that question. If God came to you and said, I'm going to give you I'm going to answer your prayer. I'm going to, I'm the genie right now. Your wish is my command. Whatever you want, I'm going to give it to you. I want you to think about what's the first thing that comes to your mind. Some of you would probably be health. Some of it would be to get out of debt. We'd have some of it would be fun stuff. I'd like to have, a new house, a bigger boat, or whatever it might be. I'd like to catch a 10-pound bass in my lifetime, and I keep praying that, but God haven't given me that yet. But anyway, we would, that's kind of, so this is serious. So God comes to Solomon and says, Solomon, what would you like to have? What can I give you? And of all the things that Solomon asked for, you know what he asked for? Wisdom. Everybody say wisdom. That was his request. He says, God, you've put me in this incredible place of influence. I'm young. I'm now find myself the king of Israel. And to be honest with you, I watch my dad, but I have no idea what I'm doing. And so if I could ask for anything, I would ask that you give me wisdom. And God said, okay. He says, especially because you've asked for that, so that you might lead others. He says, it's yours. And I love in this passage because not only does he give him wisdom, but it goes on and says, and God gave him many other things that he didn't even ask for. Now, how cool is that? And I can tell you, if we begin this journey with God, if we're always exploring and there's specific things that we're asking God for, what we're going to find, we'll often get what we're asked for, but there's so many other things that God's going to give us that we don't even know that we need, that we don't even know that we want, but that God's going to give us along the way. This whole idea of asking, petitioning God for things. The Bible's filled with people who prayed bold prayers. I think of a guy named Jabez. Some of you, years ago, this movement was out called the Prayer of Jabez. Anybody know what I'm talking about? 3 or 4 people, okay? And so there's this short verse passage in the Old Testament. It's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 10. This guy named Jabez, all we really know about him is this incredible prayer that he prayed. And the prayer was this. He says, Jabez cried out to the God of Israel and said, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. And then he went on and says, let your hand be with me and keep me from harm so that I will be free from pain. And God granted his request. God granted his request. Why? Simply because he asked for it. And that's all we know. And then, so people were challenged to pray bold prayers and to make this their prayer, and that God would enlarge their territories. And I know that my wife began to pray this prayer over me. And at that time, I was doing student ministry and a few other things, and I'm convinced that because of that prayer, and because Lynette knows my heart to want to be able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with as many people as I can, she began to pray that prayer over me. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons I'm standing on this stage, this message is being broadcast literally around the world, is because she prayed that bold prayer for me. She simply asked, and God answered that prayer. A couple years ago, as a church, we went through the Circle Maker together. Anybody remember Honey the Circle Maker? and where that whole thing came from. Honey draws it hadn't rained for a long period of time. There's this huge drought, and so Honey goes out and he takes his stick and he draws a circle in the dirt, and he plants himself inside that circle, and he begins to pray, and he says, God, I'm not leaving this circle until it rains. And the next thing you know, drops begin to fall. And so we went through that series again, and we talked about, again, praying these bold prayers. And I only point that out to say, listen, we don't have because we don't ask, right? If you don't believe me, let's look at another thing that James says here. In James chapter 4, he goes on and he says this. And this goes back into this idea of who we're petitioning, who we're asking. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? He continues, unless I'm about to give away no, you can go ahead to the next one. You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and you fight. In other words, there's these things that you want, and you're petitioning each other, but because you're not getting what you want, mostly because the people you're asking for don't have the resources or the capacity to fulfill that desire, he says you begin to fight among yourselves. He says, because you're petitioning, asking the wrong people, you end up just fighting. And then he says this, you do not have because you do not what? Ask God. You do not have simply because you didn't ask God. Now, some of you right now ought to be going, wait a minute, I can ask God? You mean God is there for me and God might actually give me what it is that I'm looking for? It's there for the asking. It's there for the asking. We have not because we ask not. Next verse. And all this is going to tie together here in just a second because I know some of the questions you're asking right now about this whole asking thing. So John writes this. He says, this is the confidence that we have in approaching God, that if we ask, everybody say ask, anything according to God's will, he hears us. Next verse. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, everybody say ask, we know that we have what we ask of him. This is the confidence that we can have as followers of Jesus Christ. If we ask, and especially if we know that we're asking in line in accordance to God's will, we can have all the confidence in the world that God's going to answer that prayer. So the question then is this: how do we know if what we're asking for is in accordance with God's will? Today, my simple answer starts right here, by exploring. What does the scripture say? Scriptures tell us what God's will is. What God's will is for your life, for the person's life next to you, for your coworker, for your neighbor, for your husband, for your son, your daughter, your mom, your dad. Scripture lets us know. God lets us know. And we can pray in accordance to God's will. Now, I could spend a whole nother series answering that question. But this is how it works. This is where it begins. You want to pray effectively and see God answer your prayers, then find out the kind of prayers that God answers. But then there's some prayers that we don't know. And so we ask anyway because God just might choose to answer that prayer. All right, so that's the first word. I just want you to start thinking about that. Second word in that invitation from Jesus is the word seek. And it simply means this: to search for in order to find. To search for in order to find. To search for in order to find. Not just, I'm just going to walk through the field and see what happens. No, I'm looking for something. There's something that I need, that I'm specifically in search of. And maybe you don't know exactly what it is, but you have but you're on a mission. For us as followers of Christ, one, we want to know what God's will is for our life. So, man, I'm going to spend my life exploring that and trying to figure that out. I'm going to search for it till I find it. Jeremiah 29:13, God made this promise. He says, when you search me when you search for me, you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart. That's what search means. We're just not kind of randomly, but we're on a mission. And God says, if we're on a mission, if we're sincere about finding him, guess what? You're going to find me, God says. And then I love this verse in Hebrews 11:6 that says this, without faith. See, that's what exploring's all about. Believing that there's things out there to be discovered. Without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that it exists and that he rewards those who earnestly what? Seek him. God wants you to discover. He has things for you. You know, the Appalachian Trail is filled with things to be explored and experienced and to be discovered. It's not that they're hid there, but we have to be willing to get on the trail and find them and discover them. And the same is true when it comes to our walk with God. The last word, the word knock, means to acquire access. To acquire access. Now, some think this is about persistence, and it may be, but I think it goes beyond that. You ever wonder why we knock 3 times? Well, it has something to do with the brain. In other words, if I walked up to your house and I went, you'd be like, what was that? Oh, something must have fell over. Okay? If I went, it would get your attention even more. You're like, what was that? But you'd probably go back to what you're doing. But if you hear somebody's knocking at the door, all right? Now, if you repeat 3 knocks in a pattern 3 times, even Penny Hofstetter is known to come to the door and answer the door. So I'm just saying, some of you will get that and some of you won't, but that's all right. Anybody watch Big Bang Theory? Oh, now you know what I'm talking about. Penny, God, you know, maybe we need to do that and God will show up more. You know, Paul asked people to pray. And he specifically asked that people would pray that doors would be opened for him to share the gospel, to share his story with other people. And all throughout the book of Acts, we see where Paul says, and doors were opened for us. And he was able to go in and share. Jesus in Revelation chapter 3 says, I stand at the door of your heart and knock. And anyone who opens up that door, I will come in and do life together with them. So let me wrap this up. Back to Matthew, where Jesus invites us on this exploration. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. He makes this statement and then he doubles down on this promise. Look at what he says. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be open to them. He says, here's the promise, and now I'm going to double down. If you do this, you're going to find what you're looking for. That's what he says. And then he goes on and he says this, and I love what he says. He says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, would give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, would give him a snake? And I got to be honest with you, every time I read those 2 verses, I'm like, I would. My wife's laughing because she knows I come from a family that's full of practical jokes. And for example, I was meeting my brother and I were meeting my dad and my uncle on a fishing trip one time, and they got there a couple hours before we did, and they set the place up, and we didn't get there till after dark, basically just in time to go to bed so that we get up early the next morning to go fishing. And as I go to crawl into my bed, I should have known that something was up because my bed was made up. I stick my feet down in the covers, and I feel something rubbery around my feet. Well, I didn't stop till I got to the front door of the cabin. They had put a rubber snake underneath my thing, and then to make it worse, the next morning when I got up and walked into the bathroom, there this thing was around the bottom of the toilet. So anyway, you can imagine what happened from there. So I'm like, God, I would probably do that. All right, anyway, I think, but luckily it doesn't stop there. Here's what he says. He says, if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? if we who are evil, who know how to play practical jokes on each other and do crazy things to each other, yet in the middle of that, we find ways to honor and to show our appreciation and love to others. He said, if we who are evil can do those things, imagine God who is nothing but good. Imagine what he wants to give to you and the good gifts that await you. So let me end this. I hope that you'll leave here today thinking about, wow, what am I missing out on? What is it that God wants to give me that I'm not getting simply because I'm not asking, I'm not seeking, I'm not knocking? As you go into this year, I want you to think about, there's some questions at the bottom of your program when you came in, and I hope you'll take some time today and this week and really think about your answer to those questions. You know, as I begin this year, for me personally, what am I asking God for? I'm asking God for a different perspective. I'll just be honest with you, it's been a hard season lately. And I need to change the way I see some things. And I need to change the way I think about some things. And so I'm asking God to give me a new perspective on life. I'm searching for clarity on some very hot topics in our society these days. I know people are looking to me for answers and my thoughts and my opinions, but my thoughts and opinions don't matter. What matters is what God says. And so I am desperately searching for God to give me some clarity to speak into not just my life, but to your life as it relates to some of the things that we're dealing with. And to be honest with you, I'm looking for new opportunities. I'm working with Trey here at Mechanicsville to find new opportunities to open up God's word and to help people grow even deeper in their relationship with God. And I really believe that God's going to answer that as I continue to explore what God has in mind. So what are you exploring today? That's the question that I'll leave you with this morning. So would you stand with me as we close at all of our campuses? Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your word. Thank you for this incredible adventure that we're on, that we get to do life with you, the God who created us. And God, there's so much that's out there for us to discover. So many things that you want to give us that we simply have not experienced or don't have because we haven't asked. We haven't taken the time to seek for it. We haven't asked you to open up doors of opportunities for us. And so God, I pray as we go through this year that we would do just that. And Father, I thank you for being a God who promises that if we do those things, that we'll find the doors will be open and things will be given to us. So Father, thank you for your goodness. And I pray all of this in Christ's name. And we all agree together and said, Amen. God bless you guys. Have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday.
We hope this message will help you explore, experience, and express God's grace and truth for your life. If Atlee Church has made a difference in your life, or you have questions about today's message, we'd love to hear from you. Simply email us at stories@atleechurch.org. Check out our website for more information about small groups, upcoming events, and how you can help financially support Atlee Church so that we can continue to share messages like this one. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so that you can receive new podcasts every week. You can also find our podcast on iTunes. Thanks again, and hope to see you next Sunday.